I am Brother Cornell West.
This is Chris Hedges.
I'm Rosa Clemente.
Hey, what's up? This is Chuck D, Public Enemy Prophets of Rage.
And this is Newsbeat.
Yes, indeed. Check 1, 2. Welcome to the very first episode of This Week in Social Justice, presented to you by the Newsbeat podcast, which is me, Manny Faces, the producer and host, and my esteemed colleagues, the managing editor, Rashid Mian, and editor-in-chief, Christopher Towarski. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm Manny.
So some of you watching may have seen us on election eve pulling together something like this. We've decided that because that went so swimmingly, we will continue to bring you a weekly jam this week in social justice. We'll be going over some of the important topics that we cover on the Newsbeat podcast that we don't always have time to maybe delve into for full podcast episodes, things that are very timely. Obviously, there's some timely things happening right now as we're still in the longest election night of our lives, I suppose. So we'll be here. Never going to end. So we'll be here for the next 9 weeks. Fridays, 1 o'clock, live streaming where you're watching us, whether it's Facebook at the Newsbeat podcast Facebook page, the Newsbeat group. You might be a member of that group. And of course, on our YouTube channel. So here we are. Welcome.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. I mean, like you said, Manny, we have a lot of news that we're always paying attention to, but we don't always get to talk about on Newsbeat or, introduce it on the podcast feed. So this is a good opportunity for that.
As with the show on election night, the election special, unlike that show, will be much less inebriated for these, but we will be entertaining some guests that will be coming up for our for this episode, for each episode of these extravaganzas. Today, real quick, maybe talk about our guests.
Yeah, I'll take the first one. So joining us around 1:15 is Miriam Krinsky. She is the executive director of, as you can see right there, executive director of Fair and Just Prosecution, which works with reform-minded district attorney candidates and district attorneys who won their races to work on reforms.
Okay. And then later in the show,
around 1:30, we've got Greg Gardner, who's the staff attorney at the Drug Policy Alliance. It's a nonprofit that advocates for drug reforms and an end to the war on drugs.
Very nice. All right. Very cool. We have a few things to talk about before we get to our guests. There obviously is a lot going on in the world of politics, which we're watching and keeping an eye on. If should anything happen during the show, we will let you know. This is what we know so far.
I think that actually I could probably make this out.
So that's where we stand right now. That is a current.
To it.
That is a current. Now, if you're listening on the podcast feed, there will be 1 or 2 visual things. There's nothing we can do about it. But trust me, this is very funny. Okay, so that being said, one of the things we want to do for this show, and we hope you are watching, and if you are watching, please comment in the comments section of the thing or the place that you're watching us. You can comment and say generally great things about how amazing we are, how handsome we are, or how well-versed in the issues of social justice we are. But you can also, and we would ask you to do this, answer our question of the day. This will come up later in the episode. So if you could, throw your comments into the comment section throughout the show. We'll put this up a few times. The question of the day is, should all drugs be legalized in the United States? All drugs, hard drugs, marijuana's legalization is happening all over the world. So that's one thing we want to ask you what you think about it, what your thoughts are. Please leave them in the comment section. That's sort of the socially justicey question of the day. And that is, I almost forgot the swooshy thing. So
I was waiting for it.
Thank you for us there. Next segment of our show shall be called Newsbeat Bites, and here's where we go into a couple of items of social justice interests that have been that are very timely. Not everyone may know about them by watching this show. We hope you're going to, just get a little bit more knowledge about some of the things that are happening around the country, and then maybe follow up with them on your own time if you want to learn a little bit more. Let's talk about it. Rashid, what do you got?
Yeah, I think the first one is important, and obviously it relates to this election. So obviously, Joe Biden is currently leading the race, and some people are attributing that to turnout among Black and Latino voters in certain states. And it turns out that there was a study done about a couple months ago that showed that the Black Lives Matter protests actually spurred more voter registrations among Democrats around that period in June. So they're crediting it to George Floyd. Obviously, that has to do with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, who were also slain. So that, that showed that how mobilizing in that way could actually lead to change in this country. And I think it's interesting that it has to do with a protest, because if you have Cori Bush over in Missouri, who was a prominent protester during the Michael Brown uprisings after he died in Missouri, in Ferguson, Missouri, a couple of years ago. And she is now a congresswoman elect.
Incredible. Yeah. Okay. Well, people could follow up on those stories, find out there's going to be a lot of parsing, what occurred to, potentially give Biden the win, potentially that made this happen.
Yeah. That's going to go down in infamy. That picture.
We'll see. So that's one of the areas of focus, I do believe. Interestingly, okay, my turn. So interestingly enough, the item that we have, I'm just trying to do this at the same time. Y'all bear with me because I'm only one guy, as great as I can be. The Mississippi flag, which for a long time contained Confederate symbolism within it for many, many years. And for many, many years, there have been people that were actively trying to change that symbolism in the Mississippi state flag. Well, earlier this year, it was voted on and approved that they would remove that, and that there were a slew of state flag candidates to replace it, and they have voted on a new state flag in Mississippi. It's the end of I think 126 years of the version of the Confederate battle flag that was in the Mississippi state flag. The new flag is dubbed the New Magnolia, anchored by the magnolia blossom in the center. Quote, a symbol long used to represent our state and the hospitality of our citizens. This is really exciting. And of course, a lot more needs to be done than simply removing the symbolism of Confederacy from a flag. But I know many people, including my good friend Genesis B, who was an artist activist and has been leading. Well, she jumped in this fight, which she says decades after it began. But it was during this last summer, during a slew of all kind of protests that you saw this change actually happen. So shouts to all the people who were actively moving to change the Confederate flag in Mississippi. It's a done deal.
I love it. Back-to-back stories about how protest led to change.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Once again, just as a shout out, Genesis B, you could find actually her talking about her activism in this lane on the podcast Hip Hop Can Save America, which is my other show. And you can find that wherever you get podcasts. Just search for Hip Hop Can Save America. It's a great conversation with a great artist activist. Christopher?
Yeah. So, I mean, with all the chaos, surrounding Trump and Biden, I think one clear winner throughout this election cycle has been drugs, right? So in line with the theme of this episode and its question of the day, Oregon became the first state in the nation to decriminalize the personal possession of illicit drugs, such as heroin, cocaine, and even methamphetamine in small amounts. It also legalized the use of psilocybin, the psychedelic compound within so-called magic mushrooms, for mental health treatments. And residents of Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota also voted to legalize marijuana for recreational use, joining 11 other states that have already done so.
A lot of people are very happy about all that.
Yeah, especially in the state that you're in.
New Jersey, Dirty Jers. Shouts to Justin Williams, comedian and professor and leader of the Newark, the Brick City Comedy Review, who's very happy that marijuana has been legalized in New Jersey and suggests that now people in Newark finally get the chance to try it out. So shouts to Brick City, Newark, New Jersey, and to everyone, again, fighting the fight. So once again, the question of the day relates to that. The question is, should hard drugs, all drugs, be legalized in the United States as a whole, much like Oregon did? When does that go into effect? Do we know?
I mean, it's think it's
I
pretty
think,
immediate, but
yeah, let me we'll double check that as the show goes on, and we'll get the
Put you
right,
on the spot. Put you on the
no,
spot.
yeah, we'll get the right date for the listeners, obviously,
And I guess
or
we're
the
going
viewers.
to talk a little bit about this later on, what that means in terms of decriminalization moving forward, certainly, but also maybe with people who have had issues in the past.
Yeah, and obviously, as we'll get into later, this obviously has to do with the war on drugs, and it's lasted for decades, almost a century, really, when you really look into it. So it's definitely significant in terms of mass incarceration.
Absolutely. So once again, you're watching the first episode of This Week in Social Justice. I'm Manny Faces. This is Christopher Tawarski, Rashid Mian, the crew behind the Newsbeat podcast. If you're not familiar with the Newsbeat podcast, you must go to where one finds podcasts and listens to and search for Newsbeat, 2 words, as you see it at the logo up at the top. What we are is we blend high-level social justice journalism, much of the stuff you're going to see us bantering about today on the show. We mix that with high-level music production and very often original contributions from independent hip-hop artists who will lend their creativity and their passion and their perspective in a very compelling manner to put together a podcast episode that not only informs but entertains. We like to say it's like as if Democracy Now! And Black Thought had a podcast baby. So there's that. Once again, go ahead, Rashid.
No, definitely. And just a lot of the issues that you're going to hear throughout this every Friday for as long as we do this is, they're going to relate to these episodes. So it's definitely, in addition to the podcast, you're going to get more information.
Right. Indeed.
We've been covering the war on drugs pretty much, since our second episode, which I'm sure later on we'll show a clip, play a clip from that episode.
Yeah, indeed. It's one of our sort of flagship episodes. We are awaiting our guests. We're going to have guests again while we bring these episodes to you. So we're not just us bantering all the time, although our banter is quite commendable. Please answer the question of the day in the comment section, or just say hi if you have no opinion on the question of the day. At the end of the show, we will display your comments at the end of the show, and we'd love to find out what others think about what you think about the question of the day. That is, once again, the question of the day. So we'll come back to that at the end of the show. Make sure you do. We want you to play along. You could play along at home.
Yeah, definitely like the stream, share the stream.
Yeah, this is our first one, y'all. So obviously we've got segments, we've got time. We're making it happen. But yes, please spread the love. Let other people know that this is some cool stuff that we're doing. Because once again, as you saw in the beginning, we are talking about some important issues.
Yeah, and if you ever miss one, you obviously go to the podcast feed later on. Wait a couple hours, it takes some time, or you could just hop back onto Facebook or YouTube at US Newsbeat, and you'll find it there.
Indeed. Once again, we will be hearing very shortly. She's on her way, as it appears, with Miriam Krinsky, the executive director of Fair and Just Prosecution. And then later on, you'll hear from Gardner, the staff attorney with the Drug Policy Alliance. A lot of good issues and questions. Once again, just to check in with the news. Here's what we know so far.
I think we know more than that, though. I think you got, what is this, game 4 of the election?
I think
this is game 4 or 5.
It might be a sweep. We'll see.
So, and then, there's some, if you're a Biden fan, there's obviously promising numbers. And I think the news organizations are just being diligent, and they're waiting to see more numbers come in from Pennsylvania before they make any calls.
Yes. If you're watching us live, don't fear. We will keep you updated should anything happen. Biden will be apparently addressing the nation tonight during prime time. So I guess they're getting ahead. So while we wait for Miriam to arrive, we were talking about the Newsbeat podcast. This might be your first time checking us out. You might be checking us out live. You might be checking us out on the replay, either on Facebook or YouTube. In either case, please understand that the main thing we do is this incredible podcast. It's an award-winning podcast. It's won several journalism awards. It features some really great independent artists, and that's what I want us to focus on. So real quick, while we're waiting for our guest to arrive, I will play you a snippet from our War on Drugs episode, which gives you a little bit of a taste of what we're talking about when we talk about this kind of podcast. Check it out, y'all.
In 1939, Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, walked on stage in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. She wasn't even allowed to walk through the front door because she was African American. She had to go through they made her go through the service elevator. And that night, for the first time, she sang a song. It's a song lots of your listeners will know. It's called Strange Fruit.
Southern trees bear strange fruit.
It's a song against lynching.
Blood on the leaves.
It imagines, the song describes
and blood at the root.
the bodies of African American men
Black bodies swinging
hanging from trees in the South.
in the southern breeze.
She describes that as the
Strange fruit hanging
strange fruit of the South.
from the poplar trees.
Her goddaughter, Lorraine Feather, said to me, "You got to understand how challenging this was for an African American woman to stand up in front of a white audience and sing a song against lynching was unheard of." And that night, Billie Holiday received a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who were the federal agency in charge of enforcing the drug laws. And they basically said, "Stop singing this song." And if you want to understand where the war on drugs begins and why it continues, I think this moment in American history is really important.
Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees by the same who bringing in the poppy seeds. Yet they blame you, call it an atrocity. You a scapegoat, you ain't make the policies. See the bigger picture. The rich are getting richer. You slanging on the corner, but who's the real slinger and who's the real pitcher? Who you point the finger? Think you know the story, but really just the gist of. Let that one linger. It's not just unfortunate that the victims of this war are disproportionate. It's not some innocent mistake how they enforcing it. And treat the symptom, but never the cause of it. Then they got the gall to say slavery was so long ago. We need to move on so we can be level C. But if the human being who wrote the law is racist, what you think that law itself gonna be?
So the man who's responsible for this warning to Billie Holiday is a
So once again, hey everyone. So once again, a taste of what the Newsbeat podcast is all about: delivering real in-depth journalism, interviews with activists, authors, experts in these fields, very often the people that these issues are directly affecting. So yeah, that's the Newsbeat podcast, y'all. Find it wherever you find podcasts.
Yeah, definitely. And listen to the whole episode because, it definitely gives you a great idea. It's just like I mentioned before, the history of the war on drugs. It's much
the long racist history, as you like to say.
It's much,
we'll be
much
covering
longer
this
than we thought.
Yes, we'll be covering this much later, but now our guest has arrived and we will be cutting over to our first guest of this week in social justice.
Hi, Miriam. Thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm good. How are you all doing?
Great. It's a busy news day, obviously, so we're all paying attention to all sorts of stuff as we move along here. So I just want to tell our guest, Miriam, again, is the executive director of Fair and Just Prosecution, and that's a nonprofit that collaborates with reform-minded prosecutors to promote an equitable justice system. And Miriam, I'm happy to have you this week because we did have some results in terms of criminal just reform measures in this election, and they seem to be a mixed bag in terms of the results. So I was just wondering if you can just tell us about some of the measures that passed and which ones you think will have the greatest impact.
Sure. So I actually think that the news was incredibly positive overall. I think what we saw around the country are voters, both through the positions and the initiatives that they supported, as well as some of the leaders that they put in office as sheriffs, as well as elected prosecutors, continuing a trend where they are embracing a view that the tough on crime, we can punish and incarcerate our way out of issues relating to substance use and mental illness and poverty, that those days are behind us, that they don't work, that voters and communities understand that they don't work. And so what we saw when we scanned around the country were a number of choices by voters as it relates to drug policy. We saw a continued trend line where now 4 other states have joined with what was previously 11 around the country, concluding that we just shouldn't be criminalizing individuals who are using cannabis, that this is not something that impacts public safety, that if there are individuals who are struggling with substance use disorder, that treatment, not jails, is the appropriate response. So when we look, we see that New Jersey, Arizona, Montana, South Dakota, as well as Mississippi, that legalized medical use of marijuana, that those states joined that trend line. And in fact, in 3 of them, it was by double-digit margins. It wasn't even close. We also know that Oregon went one step even further than that pack. That Oregon embraced the view that actually a couple of elected prosecutors are now using the pen of the policy to embrace, namely concluding that use, possession of any drug is not something that should be deemed a criminal legal system issue, that it's something that it just doesn't need to be brought into our justice system and continue to fuel mass incarceration. And instead, that money that we've spent on prisons, on jails, on courts, on policing these issues can better be devoted to addiction treatment programs. And finally, if we look at initiatives, let me flag one other thing.
Yeah, please.
Which is that voters made clear that in this moment, they want to see increased accountability and oversight, that at a time when trust in policing is at an all-time low, they want to look over the shoulders of those that we charge to have a gun and wear a badge and take away people's liberty. And so we saw that in at least 6 jurisdictions, measures were passed creating oversight bodies to look over policing or sheriff's departments, in some instances, as in San Francisco, and create an inspector general position as well. And finally, in California, joining Florida of recent past, voters concluded that individuals who are returning citizens or in California's situation on parole deserve a right to exercise the fundamental democratic right to vote that obviously is front and center right now as all of us are glued to television. And so I think that they recognize that by enabling people to have a successful return to the community, it's the right thing for the individual, it's the right thing for our community, and that disenfranchising returning citizens is not something in the interest of our community as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Miriam, a couple months ago, we did an episode on progressive prosecutors and sort of highlighting, just how much of a significant impact they have locally. And every cycle, there appears to be more and more people running for DA on a reform platform. So I was wondering if you could give listeners and viewers an overview of how these candidates performed in this election, especially in Los Angeles, where it was closely watched?
Absolutely. So we know that elected prosecutors are the gatekeepers of the justice system. They are incredibly powerful. They control who comes in. They control the trajectory of that case through all of the incredibly important decisions that they make over the life of a case. And starting in 2016, we began to see really a movement that is creating a new normal in the field of prosecution. And this year was the first test for those group of prosecutors who, in significant numbers, started to come into office running on a different agenda, in many instances challenging incumbents in 2016. So what we saw in this week's election were 2 things. First of all, we saw a number of those 2016 prosecutors get tested by the voters. In a number of instances, they were challenged. In a number of instances, a significant amount of money was invested in their defeat, including by often police unions or bodies that had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo that existed before they came into office. And what we saw with Kim Foxx in Chicago, Kim Gardner in St. Louis, Mark Dupree in Kansas City, Kansas, Andrew Warren in Tampa, Mark Gonzalez in Nueces County, Texas, was all of those incumbents succeeded in maintaining their position. None of them were defeated. We also saw a crop of new electeds come into office. And more, I think we're seeing, as you indicated, this trend line that voters understand the role of prosecutors. They are making different choices. And in some instances, they are choosing to no longer maintain that power of the incumbency that used to mean you have the job, you keep the job as long as you want. So in Los Angeles, significantly, I think today we may see the final conclusion of that race. But certainly we know in Los Angeles, George Gascon, the former district attorney from San Francisco, who was very much a trendsetter in terms of doing things differently in San Francisco, likely has defeated Jackie Lacey, the incumbent. He's ahead by around 7 percentage points. And most likely, I think the incumbent will conclude that there are just not enough votes remaining to be counted for her to mathematically be able to overtake him. We also saw in a number of other jurisdictions, in races in Arizona, in Florida, in Colorado, in Michigan, in Texas, individuals who were elected into those offices running on agendas such as those of Eli Savitt in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Karen McDonald in Michigan, that we need to end cash bail. We should stop putting people behind bars simply because they're too poor to be able to make their way out. We saw agendas such as those of Monique Worrell in Orlando, that we need to dramatically cut the population of those who are in our jails. We saw individuals, including Laura Conover in Pima, Arizona, running on a variety of issues, including the need to end the death penalty. Alonzo Payne as well in Arizona, who beat an incumbent in that race with a very reform-minded agenda. And scanning around the country, individuals in, as I mentioned, in Texas, including Austin, Texas, Jose Garza, who was pushing that public health approach to substance use disorder, including in Jose's case, individuals who are selling lower quantities of drugs. So we really saw this trend line start to build. And as I mentioned earlier, it very much used to be that incumbent DAs, incumbent elected prosecutors, were rarely challenged, and if challenged, almost never lost. That is no longer the case. I think that incumbent prosecutors are now realizing that the community is watching them and the community wants something different, and that they're going to be held accountable. And that's a good thing. Whatever one thinks about these incumbents and the candidates, it's important for the public and the community to keep an eye on those who are the gatekeepers of our justice system and to hold them responsible for a vision of that system that aligns with our community's vision of justice.
Miriam, we really appreciate it. I think it's important, especially in this moment, for us to discuss these local issues, these state issues, because there's so much attention at the federal level, and these things don't always get, the attention they deserve. Just really quickly, where can people find Fair and Just Prosecution, and how can they get involved?
So we welcome people to join us on our website, fairandjustprosecution.org, or if you just Google Fair and Just Prosecution, you can follow us on Twitter as well, or on Facebook, and you can sign up for our updates via our email sendouts and stay aware of what's happening in the field of prosecution. And we encourage people to be aware of these important positions.
Yeah, definitely a critical issue. Miriam, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks. Happy to do so.
Take care. Yeah, Miriam made just so many great points there, right, Chris? I mean, just that there's just so many issues that are in terms of bail, and especially at the DA level that rarely gets a lot of attention. We talked about it in that reform prosecutor episode about just how many incumbent DAs, it's basically like a lifetime position until they want to retire, right? So I think it's crucial for us to discuss these.
Thanks again to Miriam for checking in with us. It just so happens that we are keeping it going on the first episode, the inaugural episode of This Week in Social Justice with Newsbeat. We have waiting in the wings, Mr. Gardner. Let's just go. Let's just do it.
Yeah,
Why are we
let's
even
do
wasting
it.
time? Let's.
Gray, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So just a little bit about Gray. Gray Gardner is a staff attorney at the Drug Policy Alliance. That's a nonprofit that advocates for drug reforms and an end to the war on drugs. So let's just get right into it. Firstly, why is drug decriminalization so important in the context of the ongoing U.S. war on drugs? And what are some of the ramifications and sort of collateral damages of a drug conviction, even for personal possession?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having us, and thanks for bringing this up and for bringing additional attention to these issues. You know, the drug war has had an enormous impact over the past really 100 years, but especially over the past 50 years in increasing inequity in the country, harming individual lives, and costing us enormous amounts of money as a nation in a system of what's really oppression. I think there's a lot more awareness in the country about what we've been doing as a country for so many years over the past century, and how it's causing so much more harm than good. Drug criminalization, every year, 1.65 million drug arrests are made in this country, and 86% of those are for possession alone. It's the single largest category of offenses in this country, and we know that people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color are arrested at far higher rates for marijuana possession, especially than white people. And we're spending literally tens of millions of dollars every year for this system. As to your question about what the impacts are on people, I mean, this is an enormous impact on the lives of individual people. And I think that's actually something that, we talk a lot about mass incarceration. We talk a lot about the actual jailing of individuals for drug offenses, but we don't talk about just the general effects of drug arrests. Drug arrests have so many impacts on people's lives. It's the indignity, really, in the first place, of just being stopped by another human being, not allowed to leave, have your liberty restricted, the anxiety of having to deal with courts, with lawyers, with the threat of punishment, and then the collateral consequences that come from all of that. The effects on housing, on education, on access to public benefits. It's really impeding people's lives in an enormous way that rarely gets as much attention as it should. And this is something that, we've been working for decades to try to roll back. The system, as you know, was set up largely and ramped up 50 years ago by the the Controlled Substances Act, which incidentally was passed, 50 years ago this past month, passed and enacted and signed 50 years ago. That's why we are finally starting to take some significant steps in rolling that back. It's incredibly important, and this is a momentous year for us.
Yeah, Gray, I want to talk about that. I mean, all the work that you mentioned, just how long it's been that you guys have been doing this work, the organizing around it. I want to talk about Oregon, because that's such a significant issue. What happened a couple of days ago during the election, and Oregon, as we mentioned before, is now the first state to decriminalize possession for all drugs, including hard substances such as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines, among others. So can you explain sort of the parameters of this law, and do you see other states following suit?
Sure. I mean, what's incredible is that Oregon really took an enormous step. It's a huge milestone in rolling back the war on drugs. What Oregon did was decriminalize personal use quantities of all substances, and not only that, but it refocused the system with an orientation toward public health rather than punishment. It shifts funds. It takes tax revenues from cannabis and puts it in drug treatment and other social services that are actually helping people in a way that has never really been done to this level before. Oregon was nearly last in access to publicly funded drug treatment before the passage of this measure. And this is going to change that. This should actually put upwards of $100 million into publicly funded drug treatment in Oregon. And that's going to be a huge step at a time when we are still suffering from an overdose crisis, and people are really suffering around the country from COVID and so many other issues. This takes a different approach, focusing more on harm reduction, access to services, and again, rolling back this focus on punishment, taking that out of the equation. That's what Oregon does. And yes, it is a huge step in potentially opening the door around the country. I mean, as Cassandra Frederic has said, this really takes a sledgehammer to the cornerstone of the war on drugs. It's going further than any other reform in rolling back the system, a system that's really targeted people of color for decades. And we do expect this to set off a cascade of similar efforts around the country that center people and public health over a criminalization approach.
And Gray, every time myself and I'm sure so many others, hear about marijuana being legalized in the state, my mind immediately goes to, well, what about all the people who are locked up for possession or, some minor offense, or maybe got put inside and then, had to commit something else just to survive, and now they're in for longer, blah, blah, blah. So if you could talk a little bit, I know your group has a piece of the framework of a piece of legislation called the Drug Policy Reform Act. And it's specific, I know there's 25 points to it, but I'd like to talk specifically about the three that deal with expungement, decarceration, and the repealing of federal benefit bans for those with prior convictions, which I had no idea even happened. So if you could just talk a little bit with viewers about that.
Yeah, as I was saying, I mean, this is the 50th anniversary of the Controlled Substances Act. This is the year that we really have to make a major pivot. And that's what we've done, is we have introduced sort of a framework that lays out how that should be done at the federal level. And this is the first time that this has really been laid out during these past few decades with this much specificity. We called this the Drug Policy Reform Act. We see this as a framework. It's an initial step. But essentially what it does is refocus the classification system away from the DEA, away from an enforcement agency, and focuses on a public health approach. It shifts the classification authority to the National Institutes of Health. And in fact, it proposes abolishing the DEA, which has been ineffective, had a culture of lawlessness in recent years throughout its history, and has had a disparate impact in terms of bringing prosecutions against people of color. We want to get the DEA out of the business of classifying drugs, but we also want to deal with, again, as you pointed to, repairing some of the past harms, decarcerating those who are still incarcerated for possessory offenses in the past, for offenses that should not be criminalized. And by the way, there are a number of people who are incarcerated for very low-level distribution offenses as well, and we need to deal with that. We need to have a real conversation about sellers, and DPA has done that. DPA has laid out some points on how we need to rethink what we think of as drug distribution. But yes, we need to first decarcerate. We need to also then deal with expunging past convictions that are affecting, employment and housing, and as you said, public access to public benefits. We want to actually repeal the prohibitions that exist in federal law prohibiting people from access to federal student loans and other federal benefits programs. And at the state level as well, we want to drive policy down to the state level by putting some strings on federal funds, by showing that states that the decriminalizing personal use possession has to be a priority at the state and local level as well. So that's what we've laid out, and that's what we're hoping. Hopefully next year you'll see legislation introduced that will actually put this into a more explicit framework, a more explicit language, and take those first steps at the federal level to really changing the system entirely.
Well, Gray, we want to thank you for being on with us and taking time out to explain this stuff. If you could tell viewers where they can learn more about your group and get involved.
Yes, thanks so much. Drugpolicy.org. Please join us. We're ready to take these efforts, take what happened in Oregon, take the cannabis efforts that have progressed over this cycle and move them throughout the country. Thanks so much for having us on.
Rashad is muted.
Technical difficulty.
Live stream. I'm the grandma of today. No, I was saying that I wanted to pick up on what Gray said just really quick, because I mean, I think when people don't realize just the numbers of the people who are incarcerated, I mean, it's something like 400,000 people in state and federal prisons. And I think of federal prisons, almost half of those people are convicted for drug crimes, right? Which is incredible when you think about it. So it's just, there's just so much involved.
We had a comment, which I didn't check because we're just new to this. Gray, if you're still there, would you mind fielding this? Rashad, you want to see?
Yeah, I think.
Gray, are you still with us?
Gray's still there.
I am.
Would you mind fielding this question? I know we parted ways, but we had a question from our listeners, watchers.
Sure.
Rashad?
There's an enormous amount of work that's being done around the country on reentry. Reentry has to be a huge, a fundamental part of everything that we're doing in terms of decarceration and in terms of repairing the harms of past prohibitionist drug policies. Part of our work in the past has been to try to enhance that support. We are part of coalition efforts and direct efforts to try to enhance funding for reentry. And that's part of this overall mission, is shifting the resources from the systems of prohibition and enforcement to systems of helping people get readjusted, helping people in the community who are in need get the services, the housing, the supports that they need, to the healthcare that they need in order to be successful and have a safe landing.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you again, Gray. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just on a point that Gray brought up as well, and which is one of the reasons why we put it in the questions, is just sort of humanizing this. You see those numbers, and it's easy to look at a number, but you need to realize that those are lives, those are families behind each number, and with the prevalence of mass incarceration, with the prevalence of the criminalization of even just small-time drug use or possession. A lot of times those stories aren't told, and there are serious collateral damages. As Gray mentioned, loss of a job. Trying to get a job with a conviction like that, the loss of benefits, ostracization by family members. With this being, so prevalent, a real crisis. I'm sure many listeners, many viewers here, I know we all do, know someone, who's maybe been picked up for small possession, and instead of getting help, are just locked up. And then what happens in a serious, with someone with a serious addiction, they're behind bars with that addiction. And, I mean, this is probably much more for another episode or another discussion or whatever, but, people can get drugs in prison, that doesn't necessarily, they're not really, it's not going to necessarily help. Now, I guess there could be other arguments for, and personally, I do know one person who, I mean, I could probably say that prison probably saved their lives because they were, so dependent on drugs and rehab didn't work. But just recognizing that human toll that some of these laws have, I think is insanely important. So,
Gray, you wanted to chime in on that?
Yeah, if I can add just one more point on that. In a previous life, I spent much of my career working as a public defender. And I can tell you from experience that these low-level, what we perceive as low-level arrests, have an enormous impact on people's lives. And the system, the way it's set up, creates an enormous amount of pressure on people. We talk a lot about the plea pressure. But even before that, when you talk about some of the diversion programs and of course we want diversion programs to the extent possible as an alternative to incarceration, as an alternative to prosecution. But for example, in Washington, D.C., where I practiced for most of my career, I had a case just probably 5 or 6 years ago in which, a client was arrested for very, very small amount of marijuana. They gave sort of the standard diversion option of doing 40 hours of community service and getting the case dismissed. And we went through months of a client trying to do 40 hours, the required 40 hours of community service, and having a hard time doing that while juggling, taking care of his kids, doing his job, and eventually, having a judge issue the indignity of a sentence of 15 days because he couldn't get the community service done. 15 days in jail, it doesn't sound like much relative to some of the sentences that we hear about, but 15 days away from your family, not being able to take care of the kids, not being able to go to your job is just incredible. That somebody, one human, would do that to another for a small amount of marijuana is just hard to comprehend. But even the 40 hours of community service in the first place, we really need to rethink these types of systems, even that we think are beneficial in terms of alternatives. We really have to think about eliminating the arrests in the first place. And that's why we have focused a lot of attention on decriminalizing not just the drugs, not just possession, but these low-level offenses that allow policing to happen the way it happens, to get in people's face for public intoxication, public use, loitering. It makes zero sense that we allow that to happen. And that is a gateway, it's an entry point for police to interact with people. And it has disastrous consequences. And it just supports numbers of arrests that support bigger police budgets. We have to start looking at the big picture. I think we're doing that. We at Drug Policy Alliance are making a lot of progress on those issues, and we want everybody's help.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Gray. Thanks for sticking around. Once again, Gray Gardner, Drug Policy Alliance. You can learn about his group and its many initiatives combating this, drugpolicy.org.
Thanks again.
Thanks again, Gray.
Thanks, Gray.
All right.
Yeah, it's another issue. Is just part and parcel of the larger, police reform that we've been talking about for on this podcast, for about 3 years, but especially during this this awakening since the death of George Floyd. So, it's definitely great to have somebody with Gray's perspective.
We played earlier a clip from the War on Drugs episode, a couple of the other episodes, if you would, just to let people know exactly how we've covered some of these issues on the Newsbeat podcast, just so people know.
Just on so we have the war on drugs, and we just released this, this episode for in the lead up to the election on voter suppression. And I also want to point people to not just we have the episodes, which are great, but we also have an entire page on mass incarceration, which I think is significant because it sort of breaks down from the first step. From being being stuck in jail because you can't afford bail to enhanced sentencings that keep people in jail and prison for much longer than they need to be. And relevant to the drug discussion is that there's, I think, like I said before, I think that there's about half the people in federal prison are there for a drug conviction, and then 1/3 are there for much longer because they got charged with enhanced sentencing. So it just keeps them there locked in for so much longer than they need to be. So definitely check that, that coverage out too, because it explains sort of every element of the justice system, from the top to the bottom.
Yeah. And every podcast episode we do is also accompanied with extended bios of each of our guests, our artists, and also a full-blown, old school narrative story that delves a little deeper and addresses some of the issues that may get left out of the actual audio episode.
Very nice. Let's take this moment to, speaking of the topic of what Oregon did to kind of decriminalize possession of everything. Question of the day: should all drugs be legalized in the U.S.? Is this a policy that you agree with after you've heard some of the talk today, which has broken down the issue in some of the ways that you've heard about? What are your thoughts about it? Leave it in the comments. We'd love to throw your comments on the screen at the end of the show. Moving along. Thanks everyone for keeping with us. This is This Week in Social Justice. These are some of the issues that we've been talking about, but we're going to now talk about this week. I'm looking for it.
The whole week. We're going to talk about the whole week.
This week. But back then. So this is us news beating the past. And we'd like to bring up some of the things. We want to use this segment to talk about some of the things that have happened this week in social justice history, so to speak. So kicking this off for us this week, Christopher, what you got for us, sir?
So, and it's just incredible because, we have the potential Biden announcement today, but on this day in history, 160 years ago, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th president of the United States. And, obviously widely considered as one of the greatest presidents of all time by both historians and citizens alike. Besides maintaining the Union, and crushing the Confederacy, another of his most notable accomplishments is the Emancipation Proclamation, which gave legal basis for freeing slaves in the rebellious states. And, at Newsbeat, we try to tell, give context and sort of the stories that are left out of the history books, right? So while in many history textbooks and curricula, remember Lincoln as the great emancipator, if you spoke with many indigenous peoples, many still refer to him as the great executioner, responsible for overseeing the largest mass execution in U.S. history, when he authorized the mass hanging of 38 Dakota the day after Christmas in 1862, just days before he actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So again, it's just, this segment is just our chance to just address maybe some tidbits that and common knowledge, and sort of show what others know instead. So we'll discuss the Dakota 38 as they're known and other indigenous issues in upcoming episodes of Newsbeat.
As well we should. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. So that was the past. Before we get to the future, we're going to take this quick opportunity to shout out. Now we call it a sponsor shout out. It's not really a sponsor shout out. This is our home family. This is our parent organization, but it's a company and an organization, but it's our family. So just want to shout out to Maury Creative Studios, who makes this all possible, whether it's Newsbeat, the podcast, Newsbeat's presenting This Week in Social Justice, providing us sort of the tools and the resources, the wherewithal to do all of this. And so we just want to thank you. Maury Creative Studios is a digital marketing agency, a diamond level HubSpot solutions partner. As you can see, if you go to maurycreative.com, if you have a company, an organization trying to find ways to leverage digital marketing, Maury Creative Studios can help you grow for good. And that means like forever, but it also means for good. And its companion podcast, Grow for Good, will introduce listeners, as it says, to business leaders who have grown their companies by doing good things. It's a fantastic way to look at the world. Just finished their first season of that podcast. And again, it just goes into a lot of ways that companies are finding ways to be socially aware. How would you guys phrase it? Mission-driven
companies who...
That's why we have you.
That's
who
it.
are creating products and services that actually try to help make this world just a little bit better.
Absolutely. So once again, shouts to, that's where it was because I clicked the button. Shouts to Maury Creative Studios at maurycreative.com and the Grow for Good podcast, wherever one might find fine podcasts. So we talked about the past. Now it's time for, as John Sasala would say, the future. Let's talk about what we're looking forward to in the next week, I guess, till we meet back here. Fridays, streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Standard. Which Eastern time is it now?
They just need one. I mean, come on, just give us one.
After Halloween time. I don't know even what we're at. By the way, just in case you're wondering if there's been any updates on the presidential election.
Did you?
It looks like California's in the bag.
Manny, did you do that during our last live stream?
Shouts to baby girl faces. Does Jamie Lynn Ryan on a check-in, tacos and Newsbeat? Does she eat anything else?
I think that's the only thing that she
wasn't.
consumes.
She eating tacos on election night when she was with us. Well,
living
thank
her
you.
Best life.
Living her best life. Jamie, Jamie Lynn Ryan, if you'd like to answer the question of the day, you can change the word drugs to tacos if you must. We want to make sure that we put answers of the day. So we need some answers in the comment sections besides your very narrow food consumption.
I do know a lot of people who go to Taco Bell after partaking in.
Oh, wow.
That's a good point. They do go hand in hand. All right, once again. Okay, the future. What are we looking at upcoming in the world of social justice? And as a matter of fact, as it relates to these issues, Rashed?
Well, it's not really social justice, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention at all. It does look like Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. However you feel about that, I think it's important to also mention that Kamala Harris is breaking, a significant glass ceiling, right? She's going to be not only the first woman to be vice president, but she's going to be obviously the first Black woman. She's also Indian American. So I think, I know there's a lot of, issues that people, disagree with Kamala Harris on, especially when it comes to criminal justice and the way that she handled some of those policies in California as a DA and as an attorney general, right? But it is important news, and I think it needs to be acknowledged. And I think this is what a lot of progressives would say too. They would say that, from their point of view, we had to get Donald Trump out of office. So Kamala Harris and Joe Biden helped us get there. But I think they're going to fight to make sure that I think the progressives and other left-leaning members of the Democratic Party are going to fight to make sure that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris live up to some of the promises that they talked about in their campaign. And I think it's going to be a hard fight. I think people are going to think about, how Biden is going to compete with Republicans and Mitch McConnell, but there's really going to be a significant pushback, I think, from the left, especially when it comes to the racial reckoning that we're going to and criminal justice reform.
Yeah, I mean, I remember some guy telling us that's who really owns the party.
yes.
But to some extent, they're going to obviously want their seat at the table.
Yeah.
Yep. I agree. And as Rashad mentioned, just, holding the president accountable, regardless of party affiliation, and, looking into him and pursuing him just as relentlessly as they did Trump. He made a lot of promises and a lot of great promises. I'm talking about Biden regarding especially the environment. And so let's just hope that he actually, follows through.
And lastly, they should not forget that if this is how it goes, if Georgia flips, if Pennsylvania by way of Philadelphia flips, that once again the power of the African American vote in America. Stacey Abrams' work. What's her name? Her name is slipping. Taylor. But the work that they did to galvanize the vote, once again, showing out and showing up for a government that doesn't always reciprocate.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Stacey Abrams, because you think about, the devastating loss that she suffered in that gubernatorial campaign a couple years ago, but then she translated that into direct action, and that was voter registration and getting people involved. And look what we're seeing now in Georgia with a Democrat taking a late lead in that race.
Yeah. So let's make sure that doesn't get forgotten. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen. Well, that's not fair. Nobody answered our question of the day.
All right, so we're gonna have to ask one member of this panel to answer that question, and I'm gonna go with Manny. I really want to know his perspective on where we stand on this.
On the decriminalization of all of the drugs.
Yes.
I mean, sure. Yes, but I think as with everything else, you have to have kind of the support structure and the support stuff to manage it. So, and again, this goes to a much larger discussion about defunding the police and what does that mean? First of all, defunding the police has been a horrible marketing message. Like we needed a better marketing team behind the defund the police, because what they're not saying is take all the money away and the police walk around with cardboard swords or what, but people, they take that and they run with it. Certainly we need more programs that will help people with drug problems. Jail's never been that, that salvation, even though, like you said, there's been some, times that it can help. But in general, no. So I'm okay with the decriminalization of small,
for personal use.
For personal use.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, to me, it's kind of obvious,
it's a step that Portugal took on, several years ago, and it's showing to be effective. Obviously, it's a controversial thing, it's a decriminalize all drugs, especially for personal use, but it's definitely, I think people are more and more going to acknowledge that it's a healthcare issue too, right?
That's what I'm saying. It's not about it's not really. This is not actually a law enforcement problem. It is. It has to be done. I get it, but like you said, it's a healthcare issue. It's very much, and then it ties into, well, if not everyone has healthcare insurance, and how does that work? Can you get rehab? I mean, we reported on this back in Long Island that there was not enough, not enough available places to go, beds in rehab clinics. No. So it's just part of just throw it on a pile. But for the actual question of should what happened in Oregon kind of be the way things go, I think that would probably, and again, you point to other examples where it's shown to have been effective in, again, solving the problem, not just covering it up with. And
Portland's going to be the model for this country, right? We just hope it doesn't become. We just hope it doesn't become politicized. We really want to see how it works out and what they're doing to address it. And it's going to take a couple of years to really, get a handle on it. I don't think anybody should be making judgments either way. Within the first couple of weeks, months, or even the first year.
Yeah, and as we stated a couple of times, but viewers, listeners should definitely check out the organizations of both of our guests.
Yes.
Drug Policy Alliance, in particular, has huge amount of resources on that site, and they spell out what that future looks like. The shift. With funding and focus and all of that.
So now we hope that you learned something today on This Week in Social Justice. If you have any comments or questions or praise is probably, that's the best part. That's the best thing you can do is praise us. You can
But they
contact
can
us.
also praise us by rating the podcast at ratethispodcast.com/.
Rating and reviewing.
I'll take that. I'll take those things. You can also visit us at any time at usnewsbeat.com. You see it right there somewhere at the top. And you can support us if you feel so inclined. You can certainly support us by supporting us financially or just by sharing. Rating the podcast is super excellent. Sharing this thing, whether you're watching it live or you're catching it on the replay, sharing it and saying the Newsbeat boys up to something. And we'd love to have you back here next Friday. We keep this going if you're here. If you're here rocking with us, we'll keep it going. Fridays at 1 p.m. Eastern something time, but you know what I mean. We'll be here every Friday that we can. I'm going to leave you with, did we have anything else, guys? Did I miss anything? I think we did all right.
I think we covered it for the week.
This was all right for putting this together pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, months planning. Obviously, we're super professional.
No.
The strategy sessions.
The whole team. Thanks to the whole team.
We did not come up with it Wednesday morning at 3 a.m.
No, we didn't. I would like to shout out Sage Levine, though, for providing some assistance. John Shim on some of the technical side, and of course, once again and always and forever, in Mr. Jed Morey and the Morey Creative Studios team that is always supporting us one way or the other. We will leave you with this, gentlemen. The quote of the week.
Well, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this from a president of the United States. And I think, as Jake said, it's sad and it is truly pathetic. And of course, it is dangerous. And of course, it will go to courts. But you'll notice the president did not have any evidence presented at all. Nothing. No real, actual evidence of any kind of fraud. He talked about people putting up papers in windows. He talked about things that he'd seen on the internet. That is the president of the United States. That is the most powerful person in the world. And we see him like an obese turtle on his back, flailing in the hot sun, realizing his time is over. But he just hasn't accepted it, and he wants to take everybody down with him, including this country. Gloria?
You know, I think.
Gloria indeed.
Gloria?
Gloria.
I mean, what do you do when someone
Gloria
says that?
All yours, Gloria.
I think I was watching that live, and I think I told my wife, I said, he must have had that pocketed for the last 4 years. You don't just come up with that.
They're getting saucy. Jake Tapper refers to Donald Trump's children as spawn or offspring. So I'm not condoning. We're not, anything. We're not taking any sides. But that's kind of funny.
Yeah, they are taking some liberties in the 11th hour of what appears to be the Trump presidency.
I mean, I don't know about you, but oh, dang it. Oh, man. I'll get good at this, guys. Don't you worry. I'll get better at this.
Now
here's what we know so far. All right. Gloria, take it from here.
Take
all
it
right.
away.
One thing. Now, we've gone through this whole show. We've done the whole thing. I had all the little swooshy things, got all these things prepared, and realized that I have no way to close the show. So thank you for watching. We'll holla at you
they're going to
soon.
mind. We appreciate it.
You know what? I'll do the beginning countdown. See you next week. Fridays, 1 p.m. It's your new Friday lunchtime hotspot. And, we will toast it up. I mean, you could have a liquid lunch. I mean, there's no problem with that, right? Yes,
Let's do it.
We can still do what we do. All right. See you guys next week. Peace and love. Newsbeat, wherever you find podcasts. Peace.
I am Brother Cornell West.
This is Chris Hedges.
I'm Rosa Clemente.
Hey, what's up? This is Chuck D, Public Enemy Prophets of Rage.
And this is News